So this is the second video associated with assignment 3, research methods. All of this assignment looking at data collection techniques, and now we're specifically looking at quantitative data collection methods. So if you remember, quantitative data is numerical data. Bear that in mind obviously when we're going through the assignment. And you know, you will all have collected quantitative data, you'll have done tests, fitness tests, and the numerical data that you get is the sort of data that you might use in quantitative research. So here's our unit specification. We're looking at questionnaires, we're looking at possibly field or lab-based data collection, so where you collect the data, and we're looking at the sort of benefits and limitations, or the pros and cons of different sorts of quantitative data techniques. This is P3, it's all for P3. I know it sounds like an immense task, but it's all for P3, and there's our scenario as you well know by now. So we're looking at observation, experiments and questionnaires, which are all different types of quantitative data collection methods. We're looking at the advantages and disadvantage. You're going to actually do a notational analysis, which is observing some performance and getting numerical data for it. And we're going to look at the advantages and disadvantages of this. And again, questionnaires, which I think you're less likely to use in your project, but we'll look at anyway. Once you've collected all this sort of information and evaluated these different types of methods, you'll obviously add that information to your video screencast. So, field-based data collection. What this means pretty much is not necessarily that it's on a field, although it could be, but it means that it's not in a clinical lab situation. So anywhere in its sort of more normal environment. If you were studying tennis data, you'd be playing tennis on the tennis court outside rather than doing some kind of fitness test in a lab. And there are pros and cons. So the pros here show that it could be quite cheap. You're not having to hire expensive lab facilities. It's possible the equipment might be cheaper. You're observing the athletes in their natural environment. It can be very false being in a lab, sort of white coat syndrome testing. So it might get more valid data. And we have what we call high ecological validity. And what that means is that this is quite realistic data that you can generalize to other performers quite realistically. So it's generalizable to a broader, bigger population. However, you might find that there are less variables that you can control outside. Who knows who's going to come by or watch or possibly affect your performers and therefore affect your results. So this is called low internal validity, controlling the variables within the experiment itself, which you might have less control of. And with that in mind, your reliability might be lower, because reliability looks at, can you replicate this test exactly the same way and get similar results? So if you happen to have somebody cheering on the sideline that you have no control over on one day, they might not be then the next, so reliability might be lower. Conversely then, lab-based experiments or lab-based data. Here are the pros. So you can control a lot of the extraneous variables, the things like the people watching that you didn't know. You can have a much more controlled environment, so that you're hopefully only going to have one variable, the independent variable, affecting the dependent variable. So it's again controlling everything else and eliminating all other effects. This therefore gives it high internal validity, and you're more likely to then be able to conclude a causal effect, i.e. this affected this. So it's all again down to the amount of control you have in the space. But incredibly expensive, and a lot of the equipment and the machinery and the testing, you know, might need training. It's perhaps low ecologically valid because it's not a natural situation. It's in quite a false situation, so they sort of all feed into each other. So pros and cons of field versus lab-based experiments. So moving on to look at one type of quantitative data collection, observation. And this is actually an example of notational analysis. So here we're looking at free throw stats, and these are the different performers in a team of basketball, and these are different matches. So they've mapped through the whole season to give you overall percentages on shots and fouls. So Briscoe here didn't attempt any free throws or didn't go to the line until these 2 games. He attempted 2 and he made 1 of those, so he got 1 out of 4. So this is just observing the performance, and based on the certain criteria, in this case, how many free throws did they attempt and make, you get your numerical data. What we could have, and what I want you to do, is you'll watch one person, and you, instead of having different matches or different games here, you're going to have different criteria. So you might have 3 free throws attempted, free throws made, layups attempted, layups made, passing attempted, passing successful, that kind of thing. So you're going to watch 1 if not 2 performers and do a sort of fuller skills-based notational analysis on them, and we'll then talk about the pros and cons, because the with all of these techniques there are benefits. You can obviously identify strengths and weaknesses. If they took 20 free throws and scored none, that would identify free throwing as a weakness. You could video them and annotate it later, so you could do the data afterwards. That would be probably time consuming. You can value all sorts of performance. So in your data criteria that you're looking for, you might talk about interceptions or defensive work, and sometimes it's easy to just credit the people who score. So it enables you to value all elements of contribution within the skills. And obviously you can compare between your performance, as that example previously did, on several occasions and see how you improve, or compare between different players. But it's pretty difficult watching everything a player does, and if you've got 5 on court or football 11 on pitch, trying to observe them, you might need several observers, and they will need training because they obviously need to know the sport and the skills inside out. It's possible you might miss some elements of their behaviour, and of course if you get this kind of feedback, it might be good, but it might be pretty demoralising also, so you have to be quite mindful of that. Moving on then to questionnaires. You've probably at some point had to answer one either in written form or verbally, and you'll possibly know that there are different types of questions. Closed questions, which can be more quantitative, and you get a numerical, how heavy are you, write down the value. Open questions tends to go a little bit more qualitative, so a questionnaire that you give somebody might include both kinds of information. This is more the what, and this is more the why. Perhaps you can get more depth of detail from these kinds of open questions. And here are some examples. Are you prone to injury? Yes or no? Do you agree with the extrinsic rewards of as a motivational tool for young players? Yes or no? Have you experienced any form of punishment for not taking part in PE? Yes or no? So this is quite discrete data, quite simplistic, closed questions. This is more open. How do you feel? So you're expecting an explanation. Why do you think? You're expecting an explanation. So there's merits to both. Things to bear in mind when you're producing a questionnaire would be, what actually do you want out of it? You have to be quite careful, because in our scenario, for example, we're looking at female gymnasts and potential eating disorders. So you would have to be, fairly sensitive as the experimenter to how you phrase things, and obviously be quite careful that you didn't bias the questions to manipulate what data you get to suit what you want it to say. You have to try to remain objective as much as possible. You'd base your questionnaire on the sample, so the age, the intelligence, the language you use might be quite relevant, or the technical language you use might be quite relevant depending on who you're sampling. The length and the appearance, so people don't tend to want to answer 25 in-depth questions. So you want to make it as manageable and accessible as possible. Think about how you would distribute it. Are you going to sit down with the people to go through the questionnaire? Are you going to email them it and they hope they send it back? So there's pitfalls in those sort of distribution factors. And just think about how you're going to analyze the data once you get it. So pros and cons of questionnaires. They need to be people friendly. They can reduce, because they can be more anonymous, they might reduce participant bias, which means the people saying what they think they want you to say. Anonymity really helps that. You can make it simple in terms of Likert scales. So do you agree, strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree, or 1 to 5 ratings, Likert scales. And you can obviously be quite structured and quite defined with what you want to gain from your questionnaire. But even if you get a good answer, you're not necessarily in a position to probe and find out more. So if they say, yes, I have experienced X, Y, and Z, you're not going to be in a position to follow that up with, why questions. Some of them can be too complicated. Some of them, if you are distributing it, remotely, then you might not get responses, which can be a problem for sample size. You can interpret their responses to suit what you want. And obviously you need to make sure that you don't blow their minds with technical language that they don't actually understand. So your task 2 requires you to add to your screencast the pros and what observational analysis or data collection, quantitative data collection is, and the pros and cons. Experimental data collection, so field versus lab, pros and cons, and questionnaire, pros and cons. So just to finish by showing you the actual assignment brief, where you get again sort of guidance in terms of what you need to complete, but it will all be put into your video screencast.